Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I have a special episode with you. It's kind of short, but this guy is stretched for time. It's Marc Morano, who is a former senior staff of the Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee. He's also the lead at climatedepot.com and the author of Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change and Green Fraud and The Great Reset. The Great Reset is just now released, and in it, he pulls from widely available documents showing that the so-called Great Reset is not a conspiracy theory. In this conversation, we talk about the contents of his book and what he thinks we can do to be a part of the Great Reject. Without further ado, here is Marc Morano. How's your morning going?
Good. I actually was on Fox and Friends this morning, so I had to get up early and
Oh, wow.
been doing interviews all day. I'm going to California next week. Where do you live? You're in Pacific. Where are you in California?
I'm in Washington State.
Washington State. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll be going to Silicon Valley to give a speech in there, Santa Clara. So it's apparently the last few remaining an audience of a couple hundred of the California Liberty Forum, but they've been cut in half since I last spoke to them in 2019 because a lot of the members moved out of California after COVID.
Oh, why would they want to do that?
Yeah, it's a dwindling state. So
It is interesting. So we could just dive in if you want to.
Sure. Yeah, let's go. Okay.
It's kind of interesting. The Great Reset has been billed quite frequently by the corporate overlords of Silicon Valley as a conspiracy theory, even though the people who have engineered it have basically said what it is, right?
Yes. What happened here is in 2020, conspiracy realities outnumbered conspiracy theories. And I like to say there's no such thing as a conspiracy theory anymore. There are conspiracy observations. And that's literally what we are living through. When you look at what happened with COVID lockdowns, pretty much everything they said was a conspiracy theory has come true. And that includes everything from the vaccine mandates to lockdowns, to the digital currency, to watching Canadians have their money shut off, access to their own money shut off. And we're now seeing, Bill Gates as America's largest farmland owner, at the same time pushing what he calls synthetic beef, otherwise known as lab-grown fake meat. So as America's largest farmland owner, he'll have sway. We're seeing equity asset firms buy up land. The World Economic Forum slogan, "You'll own nothing and you'll be happy," seems like closer and closer reality as there are more bankruptcies, foreclosures, and land is being gobbled up by the equity asset class, China, and billionaires. So this no longer can be called in any way, shape, form a conspiracy theory because the World Economic Forum is very clear. And in my book, by the way, I cite New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, NBC News, mainstream sources, the scientific journals, Nature, 230 medical journals, all calling for versions of climate, energy lockdowns using the same template that they use for COVID. So anyone who said, oh, it's a conspiracy, and by the way, I have a whole chapter, the BBC, calling the Great Reset a conspiracy theory, and I have liberals attacking other liberals for joining in with conservatives to worry about the Great Reset. So I take all this on head on in the book, and I think that helps the reader. This isn't one man's take. My book is a collection of research of all the exact quotes from the World Economic Forum and analysis by global historians, economists, and figures from the left and the right. And I like to say it's no longer a left-right political diagram. This is a tyranny versus freedom. And that's why I devote a whole chapter to welcoming people like Naomi Wolf, former Clinton Gore advisor, people like Russell Brand, Hollywood socialist actor, people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., people like Jimmy Dore, people like Glenn Greenwald, people like Bill Maher. I welcome them in this battle against this permanent lockdown mentality and tyranny of freedom. And so that's one of the keys. So this is not a conspiracy. So.
No, and your book is nothing if not full of citations. It's basically citation after citation after citation. You have it all. It's all there for anybody to look at and anybody to see. One question that I have is that how does one even comprehend how to slow down the momentum? Because there seems to be so many things set up in law and public opinion that it just seems like it's inevitable now. How does one resist resist such a reset?
Well, I have a whole chapter devoted to the great reject or the great resist. And, it's a great question because I think the reason we're in this mess, it's because of the timid politicians and the virtue signaling politicians. And Arnold Schwarzenegger is a great example. He was governor of California, 2005, 6, 7. And he did this California climate bill as an example. And everyone patted him on the back, committed California to all the stuff we're seeing come home to roost today. But at the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger was a climate hero, and he didn't pay 1 cent, 1 ounce of that politically because none of the stuff he committed to happened while he was in office. So it's the same thing Governor Newsom's doing today with banning the gas-powered car. He's being championed. The Biden administration energy secretary, everyone just praising him up and down. Bold leadership. This is what climate leadership looks like. We've got to follow California. The problem is his term of office, he'll probably never have to deal with the consequences of it. And you go back, all these Republican politicians who've committed, I think we should stay in the UN Paris Agreement. Yes, climate's a problem and we need a solution, but not as far as the Green New Deal. Same thing with COVID. We'll do a lockdown, but we'll try to keep it short or we'll keep it late. So they accept the premise. We've got to stop accepting the premise of stuff. And that is the problem. So I think what happened and the way this happens is it comes from the non-political world. And I detail in that last chapter how to fight back. And it comes from the most unexpected of places. School board meetings. Angry parents showed up at school boards across the country. And I profiled the one in Virginia because it seemed to be the most significant, ground zero, against critical race, against transgender ideology, and against the COVID theater, the masking and lockdowns and social distancing of kids and plastic bubbles and all that nonsense. And, playing a saxophone with a mask on and a slit in it so you can be mask compliant. They protested so loud, so vociferously, some parents getting arrested, hauled away in front of the cameras. School boards did what school boards do. They had arrogant, condescending, union-type leadership attitude. What happened? Virginia went from a blue state to a red state in a shock election. New Jersey almost did the exact same thing. It would have been a bigger shock in New Jersey because it was entrenched. Democratic Party freaked out, did internal focus groups, found out even their own base wanted to return to normal. Because of those parents' protests, created election earthquake. Democratic Party reviewed itself. Every major city after these elections, from San Francisco to LA to New York to Boston to Baltimore to Washington to Philadelphia, all lifted the vax mask mandates as a result of, and I quote this in the last chapter, according to the New York Times is reporting this. So that's the kind of power of the pushback. And it didn't come from political leaders. It came from parents.
That is hopeful, but at the same time, you watch the Biden administration in the run-up to the fall elections, increasing the rhetoric. When those parents started to speak out, Merrick Garland, the head of DOJ, called them white supremacists, right? And now Biden's calling half the country extremists of some sort or another. So do you think that the Democrats will actually listen and adjust their rhetoric? Because it seems like they're just in it to win it at this point.
Yeah. Okay. That was what happened then. That was on the COVID data. So what's happening now with Biden doing this is an old demonization trick. And I don't know of any U.S. president. Now, there's a clip surfacing of Donald Trump calling, I think he's calling the Democrats fascists, but it's in a Donald Trump way. It's an impromptu press conference. It's a couple comments. It's mostly targeted, but people are trying to draw some kind of equivalency here. There isn't. I mean, this was a dark, frightening speech. And the idea is to divide us, to give a justification. We saw this with the lockdowns. If you didn't wear the mask, if you didn't get the vaccine, and I didn't do either, although I did have to wear masks when I flew a few key places if I didn't want to deal with the hassle, but I tried to always create conflict with it. But anyway, the idea is you weren't a person in good standing with the government. And so we saw it even further in the Canadian trucker rebellion when, they got their own money, corporate government collusion. The banks worked with Justin Trudeau. He declared them terrorists too. The Canadian convoy and said they were committing terrorism. They had access to their own funds denied. The people made them coffee or donuts. They had access to their own funds denied. The head of police was pondering going after spouses and kids and essentially destroying families if anyone in your family was involved. And I quote historians and say, yeah, this is stuff has happened in history before, but never in places we've considered free societies. And I detail in the book how in countries in Africa, Europe, that if you don't have the vaccine, they shut off your banking, all sorts of citizenship rights that you thought you enjoyed. So this is the way Biden is setting that stage, that there's a first-class citizen, and then there's those that aren't quite up to snuff. Either they're a threat to democracy or they don't follow the rules. And this is very much at a China social credit system. Yeah. And that is what they're trying to instill here. It's ironic because if you remember back in the 90s, all the free trade agreements, NAFTA, world trade, which ended up gutting the American industrial base. One of the arguments was, well, if we give China capitalism, they'll become more like us and they'll be less tyrannical. Instead, we're now becoming more like China. Yeah. In fact, I quote in the book, Justin Trudeau, UN climate chief, New York Times columnist, presidential advisors, administrators, all praising China's one-party rule for doing it right, for getting things done without the messiness of democracy. Justin Trudeau has great admiration. So COVID lockdowns and the emergency powers behind them gave these leaders and the unelected bureaucrats Chinese-style one-party rule power. And that is what they don't want to give up. That's why with the COVID lockdown, emergency decree is still in effect. And that's why, according to Associated Press, Biden's about to declare a national climate emergency just after the November midterms.
Oh, that would be very fortunate for him. I mean, not for us. But
130 new presidential powers if he does.
Oh, really? Okay. So, but if you look at his rhetoric, what he's doing is dehumanizing his opposition in order to deperson them. Like first you're evil and then you don't belong anymore. So with all of the powers that they have with technology and social media and stuff, and it seems like Twitter and Facebook will follow their lead and squash any story that they don't want and kick anybody off that they don't want. It seems like either we unplug or we circumvent that, because it seems like the power has been consolidated already so thoroughly that is there any way to directly resist this?
Well, yeah, there's lots of ways to resist it. But to your point, though, we've seen a trend. Two recent politicians have said remarkable things. One of them was Kathy Hochul, if I'm saying her name right, the interim governor of New York, the appointed governor. She actually said, you MAGA people, get out of the state. We don't want you. Go to Florida. Get lost. She could care less about winning them over or representing them. Yeah. Charlie Crist, running for governor in Florida against Ron DeSantis, said the same thing. He actually said, if you like DeSantis, you like Trump, I don't want your vote. Now, tie this into exactly what you're saying. Disney, NBA, sporting events, all these Hollywood, they all say the same thing. If you don't like our politics, our policies, our promotion of transgender, we don't need your business. Take a hike. Say that's what the NFL basically told fans, with kneeling in the national anthem. They don't care anymore. They want to marginalize people so much. They want to marginalize them and remove them. And that is what we're witnessing firsthand. And in terms of fighting back, it's going to take a revolution. I say the Berlin Wall didn't fall because the East German parliament decided, 40 years of Soviet oppression is enough, so let's tear down the wall in 1989. It fell because the people no longer gave their consent to tyranny. And that can well up in ways that I can't sit here and say, well, we need to do X, Y, Z. Yeah. It spontaneously happens. I couldn't have predicted a year ago about school board protests that were going to lead to this kind of rebellion. I mean, that wasn't on my radar. It wasn't on a lot of people's radar.
Yeah. Well, the words rebellion and revolution incite or images of violence, right? Insurrection, right? But they are the rhetoric from the powers that be are already casting anybody who's against them as basically enemies of the state, as violent revolutionaries. And yes. I suppose one method of going about that is person-to-person contact, like you were saying, showing up to meetings, being vociferous, but also articulate. Right. And stressing the civility of such a movement would be absolutely key. Is that what you would say? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, obviously January six style thing, that's not going to get you anywhere. People going and essentially doing a riot. Although there's a lot of questions about what actually happened and whether it let in and et cetera. But I'm not going to get into that. But no, that's not the way you necessarily do it. Although the Dutch farmer protest is a way where farmers just basically say, no, we're not going along, and they've shut down the capital. Even what the Canadian truckers did to Ottawa, the capital of Canada. These are the kinds of things that we need to look at. And we've seen these protests against the vax mandates, against lockdowns from Paris to Belgium to Germany to Australia to New Zealand. They're not covered in the media generally at all, the mainstream media, but you can find the clips. They're very, very inspiring. I opened that last chapter about rebellion with an interview with Václav Klaus, the former Czech president, Czech president who was formerly Czechoslovakia, a country who lived under communism most of his life. He was considered a leading intellectual who was essentially banned by the Communist Party. And he says when he saw what happened with COVID, with the lockdowns, the idea of social distancing, he said the communists had the exact same thing. They didn't want people to congregate. The right to assembly was infringed upon because he said that they believed that if people got together, they would start voicing concerns and start plotting against the government. And this is one of the things he does. So he draws direct parallels to the COVID lockdowns and that. And he's also in tune to potentially coming climate and energy lockdowns, which I believe we're actually living through at this moment. And California is kicking it off. In Colorado, when government and utilities, now again, a utility is a glorified branch of the government in many ways because they're so regulated. So the president of Czech Republic, basically, he's warning of these. The climate now is the pivot. And I have the World Economic Forum head actually said the next crisis is already here, the climate crisis. So what they've learned from COVID, first of all, it's going to be a merging of COVID and climate. And they've already had studies on this. Unchecked climate change leads to more viruses. And the Harvard School of Government's warned, the journal Nature has a paper out on this. All the organs of the mainstream establishment are now behind this idea that unless we tackle climate, we're going to end up with more COVIDs. So if you don't support the Green New Deal or the UN Paris Agreement, you're a grandma killer. That's the new memo coming out of all the main organs. And I cover that in a whole chapter in my book about, the morphing of COVID and climate. 2 chapters on the morphing of COVID and climate, one specifically on these climate energy lockdowns. And it's actually not my phrase. A Bill Gates, George Soros funded professor in Europe, Mariana Mazzucato, actually came up with the phrase climate lockdowns. And she says, here's what's needed. And it literally sounds like everything that's happening. And again, just to recap, they're collapsing our energy. They're collapsing our food supply, and now they're collapsing our transportation. They collapsed our free speech. They're well on their way. We're not like the Great Reset isn't some theoretical thing down the road. We're living in it. We're living through it right now. It's happening.
Yeah. Did you ever consider yourself a revolutionary, or have you long studied civil rights movements throughout history?
Great question. I was always a political activist. Ronald Reagan was sort of where I cut my teeth politically, volunteering on his 1980 campaign. But here's the interesting thing. After Ronald Reagan, I was never a big fan of George W. Bush, and I ended up begrudgingly voted for George W. Bush. And probably I don't think I voted for Bob Dole. I always voted Libertarian or Independent Party. But here's the thing. Since COVID lockdowns and since I've seen the attacks on Trump, I now go back, and especially seeing the Pentagon war state, I go back. I didn't really support the Gulf War or the Iraq War or the occupation of Afghanistan, but I always thought, Dick Cheney, I like him. He's more conservative. I now loathe Dick Cheney. I loathe George W. Bush. I look back at all the Republican nominees from Mitt Romney to John McCain to Bob Dole to George H.W. Bush. You can have them all. Take them. And when I hear people say, Donald Trump is he's a horrible Republican, I'm like, I'm sorry. I would take Trump over any of the names I just mentioned. But my point is, I've evolved politically the same way the left is getting red-pilled and coming. I think a lot of us have been red-pilled and now see the Republican Party as part of this thing. It's not a 2-party system. It's a 1-party system. And I think even going back to things like Occupy Wall Street, I would think, a bunch of left-wing socialist nuts. And there was a lot of left-wing nuts in those groups. But I covered this as a journalist. They actually, looking back, this is a reevaluation. They had a lot of messages they were right on against NAFTA, against the world trade, against this globalization, which led to China gutting out our industrial base and the rise of China. So all these people I used to make fun of I no longer are now reevaluating. And more importantly, I do believe that Dick Cheney was a war profiteer. I do believe it possibly should have gone to jail over the whole Halliburton and the defense contracts. I sound like I should have been in Huffington Post or MSNBC, but this is the new political reality.
Yeah. So we've covered social media and media. They own the narrative. They can deperson you. They also own access to the financial, well, at least Canada does. They can shut off your bank account. It seems like they were able to get away with that to a certain degree. But is there another attack or vector along capital? Can we challenge capital? Can we rearrange that seat of power in order to?
Well, I mean, you have the whole cryptocurrency but what's happening is they're targeting that directly. They want a cashless society. So I cover in the book a lot about the digital currency movement. Joe Biden this year issued a presidential central bank digital currency executive order. And the idea is they want to crush any kind of decentralized cryptocurrency, and they want a central bank currency that they can control. They also want the central federal control of a charging grid for the mandated electric cars we're going to have to buy so they can turn them off. They want to turn off your finances. And so one of the things on this digital currency that they're trying to do is instill this sort of Chinese social credit system. And I have a whole chapter on what China has done. And China monitors your finances, and they can actually, if you're like in bankruptcy or near bankruptcy, you can be alerted when you're walking down the street. People will be alerted near you that someone in not good standing and who's bankrupt is coming by near them. And remember, one of the mottos of the Great Reset is you'll have no privacy, but life will never have been better. The idea is you'll be shamed publicly, you'll have to change, you'll have to conform. It's all about conformity and no dissent. That's what it's all about. Of course, that's what tyranny is all about. And that's antithetical to everything America was. But the digital currency is huge. I cover the African countries, European countries who shut off the digital access to people's own bank accounts through their if they didn't get the vaccine. And I think I mentioned this, I don't know if I did, but UN and MasterCard joining up. Did I mention that?
No.
The United Nations and MasterCard have joined up to have a credit card called Docotomy. I write about this in the book. And the idea is they monitor your carbon footprint on all your spending. So if you're buying, gas or you're eating a lot of meat, it's adding up. And once you hit your carbon footprint max, it cuts off your ability to spend money. Now, right now, you have a choice. You don't have to get this new card. But how long are we going to have that choice? Remember, we had a choice initially about vaccines. We had a choice initially, about social distancing until it becomes mandatory. That is a very frightening thing. So they're going to integrate it in a Chinese social credit system way, monitoring your carbon footprint, but it's going to be beyond that. If you have what can be deemed hate speech on Twitter, you could go to your local supermarket and boom, your card's not working, and it'll say until you remove the hate speech from your social media account, your card will not work. That's not a far-fetched conspiracy. That's reality. So I have a big warnings about the digital currency that they want to push on us, the centralized digital currency on us. And that is very scary because we can see how compliant. I mean, here's another example of how compliant the banking industry is to government. We have Gavin Newsom issue an executive order to ban gas-powered cars. Then an unelected CARB, California Air Resources Board, issues the directive. It was never voted on. There was no referendum. The California legislature wasn't involved. The World Bank former president announced at a World Bank meeting he wanted to stop all financing of gas-powered cars, which means at the automaker level, they're not going to have funding to make it. But here's the banking part. Australian banks are now announcing they won't give out loans to anyone seeking to buy a gas-powered car because it's bad for the planet, and they're going to get the ball rolling. So there you go. That's a classic example. That's environmental social governance. That's why if you own an oil drilling company or a mining company, you go to get a bank loan these days, your environment social governance score is going to be very low. You're going to pay higher interest rates. You're going to get less money. You're going to have less investor attraction. This is how they control, and most people have no clue because you go about your daily life, you wouldn't even read this. You're not reading about this in the New York Times, Washington Post, or watching it on the nightly news. No one knows this is happening. Everything they're doing, we didn't vote to stop eating meat. We didn't vote to stop driving gas-powered cars. We didn't vote for energy shortages. This was all decided by these elites with weak allegedly our side fighting Republicans, not fighting an ounce and allowing it all to go through.
Okay. What's your take on the 87,000? I think that's the correct number, IRS agents that they just hired?
Well, that is frightening. I mean, if you look back at the Obama administration, Clinton administration, they've always used the political powers, the agencies of the administrative branch, executive branch, to go after their political enemies. And Richard Nixon, of course, was accused of this. But the idea of doubling this, and they claim it's to go after millionaires or billionaires. There's not enough millionaires, billionaires to justify it. This is clearly intimidation. It's clearly in line with you go along. And believe me, these can be weaponized the same way we're seeing the FBI weaponized. If you come out with a stance or a movement that's contrary to what the government is pushing, say you violate lockdown curfew, or say you have too many people at your backyard barbecue, not only can your neighbor rat you out and get rewarded and the utilities shut off your water and electricity, but now you could be audited because you've been a bad boy and against the dissent. So it's just a simple way to look at it. Every one of your questions leads to one thing. Yeah. It's a transfer of power and control to central powers, to a power transferring up to fewer and fewer people. Centralization of power. That's what's deciding. All these decisions I'm telling you about, energy, food, transportation, speech, it's all being decided by fewer and fewer people. It's no longer a mass democracy or a free country. And this is the Great Reset. All their tenets are there. You'll own nothing and be happy. U.S. will no longer be a superpower. You will no longer be eating meat. Climate will be the number one agenda. You'll have no privacy. They lay it all out in these slick videos.
Mm-hmm. So what are the practical steps? Are you saying show up to city council meetings, show up, make connections?
It's a great question. I guess, I would say the practical steps are to be aware, number one.
Yeah.
You have to be aware. So you have to know if the Republican nominee is, I'll just say, first of all, Mike Pence, someone like Mike Pence. The Republican nominee is a Mike Pence or some other just establishment figure. You have to know that you've lost this round of the battle, that this is just the party playing along. The new Prime Minister of England, by the way, is a World Economic Forum contributor. Oh. The head of the Netherlands, where they're shutting down agriculture, Europe's number one meat exporter, shutting it down due to net zero climate goals, stopping high yield agriculture, crushing family farms, particularly, not the corporate, not the equity asset, not the Bill Gates, not the Chinese one. It's going after the small mom and pops. That president in that country is a young leader of the World Economic Forum. Justin Trudeau is a young leader. The head of it has bragged. World Economic Forum head Klaus Schwab has bragged that he penetrates the cabinets, and he sees some of the countries have more than half of their cabinets are from his leadership school. So you have to look at who's being elected. But I guess awareness is the number one thing, and resistance at every level. I mean, in listening to what Klaus, I know there's too many Klauses here, but the former president of Czech Republic who grew up under communism, not Klaus Schwab, but Václav Klaus, there's really no way you can actually say, do this, do that. You've got to just resist at all levels and be open to fighting it. And you've got to support alternate means. In other words, homeschool your kid, get on different social media. Don't support the Facebook, Twitters with these policies. Get politicians to try to expose them. Go to town halls. You've got to change the narrative. Until I'm just watching Australian Parliament. Actually, I was watching something, and there's this chill that goes around when they talking about the climate net zero goals. Everyone agrees. Don't you agree? It's kind of like this. On one hand, it's ideology pushing this, sort of like a cult-like or religious ideology, and it's seeking a power pushing these agenda, the Great Reset and climate agenda. But it's also an intimidation. People don't want to be ostracized. I mean, people in power. So it's these timid Republicans. One of the things I've always felt with as a political activist is let's nominate people to just be in their face. And I would give you national examples would be Rand Paul is one of the best. But even Rand Paul could be a lot stronger with Fauci. I mean, I almost wish he had sat down with Fauci instead of specific, Fauci should have said, Mr. Fauci, do you think it's right that you, being the highest paid federal government employee of 40 years, control this budget, control that budget, control the pharmaceutical, and that everyone has to answer to you? Are you worried that people who dissent with you would be afraid to dissent because you have so much power? Do you think it's a good idea that our FDA commissioner goes from the FDA to over to big pharma and has a revolving door back and forth, and that all these politicians are accepting money? I mean, it would have been great to expose even more of this, but we have national leaders. I do like Rand Paul. He's one, and a lot of great congressmen. Particularly, I'm talking about COVID on this. So I think we just got to change the narrative, and I think magic will follow. I mean, a lot of good things will follow. Stuff that I can't even conceive of right now will follow. But until we do that, people are intimidated. You don't drive an electric car. You don't believe in climate change. You don't support the Green New Deal, net zero. You're violating. You're violating the lockdown, or you didn't get the vaccines. I mean, I told everyone who would listen, I didn't get the vaccine. It was the best decision I ever made. I never even came close to considering it. So you can't be intimidated. And I was advising people who work for the federal government. Well, they're doing this now. I'm going to have to quit. I'm thinking of retiring anyway. I said, here's what you do. The number one thing you don't do is walk away quietly. If whatever you do, make their lives as miserable as possible at every level that you're dealing with. Resist, make them write you up, make them fight you, make them come in, take time out of their day, fight them at every level, resist the mask, resist the vaccine. And this is how you do it. You just make it so untenable for these would-be tyrants that they eventually give up. And that's one of the ways to do it.
I really wanted to reiterate about the electric cars, because it sounds like a good idea. Well, it's billed as a good idea, but it's taking just as much energy from the earth. The making of the batteries is so much just as destructive as gasoline, and the energy grid can't really support it yet. And they're not making big inroads for nuclear power, right? They're not building up the infrastructure, it doesn't seem like. But the one thing that the electric car does give is the ability for a centralized government to see how much you're driving it. They can turn it off and shut it down. And I don't know if the environmental benefits are actually work out, but it does work out in favor of a centralized switch, right? Because it's all connected.
I mean, electric cars. Okay, this is unbelievable that this is even an issue. I'm not saying we shouldn't allow electric cars, but the idea that they're more eco-friendly is laughable. They're made with fossil fuels. They require, I like to say, electric cars dig the earth, not in a groovy 1970s Brady Bunch way, but in a deep excavating way for rare earth metals and minerals, chiefly in Congo and South America and China, even Russia with nickel. And these are countries with lower environmental standards. So we're outsourcing our environmental destruction to these other countries that have lower, not only environmental standards, but human rights standards. So what ends up happening is you dig the earth, you get all these rare earth mining. Even if we dig up the metals and mining here, we send it to China for refinement and processing. So China's selling us 90% of solar panels. China's responsible for, I think it was 80% of the world's cobalt. We're ending up, which is needed for electric cars. So it just means increased reliance on China. All we're doing is empowering China. At the same time, you bring the cars here, not only do you have all the problems with recharging, but then you have the batteries that need to be recycled in landfills. And then you also have, where are you recharging your cars? You're plugging it into a grid that's still 80% fossil fuels. So the whole thing is just a Ponzi scheme of absurdity upon layer upon layer. And the idea that we should ban the gas-powered car. Let me give you an example of how people don't think. 1890s, major cities in the U.S., there was an academic studying the horse manure or the animal manure problem, because that was the primary transport. And they said by the year, 3 decades out, there's going to be animal manure 3 stories high in every major Northeast city. It's going to be disgusting. There's filth, there's disease, there's flies, vermin. What happened? The invention of the internal combustion engine, the gas-powered car, took away animal transport as the chief means and cleaned up our cities from the animal dung and crap that was all over. You could also say that oil saved the whales. Whale oil was driving whales to extinction, the need for it. And then once they started digging for oil, fossil fuels saved the species of whales. So there's always pros and cons to everything. Yeah. And the whole idea of, solar and wind that use the earth. No, solar takes up land. Wind takes up land. Wind is a bird blender. They get exemptions for killing birds. It kills apex predators. It kills rare birds, endangered species. Solar takes up huge swaths of land. And the big sin of both wind and solar is they don't produce the energy to justify it. It was estimated 1 coal worker produces the same amount of energy as 80 solar workers, 79 solar workers. And this is the problem, is it's a giant virtue signal of ugliness, of land consumption for no energy. It'd be one thing if they were competitive, at least. You could argue about all this, but it's not even competitive with fossil fuels on any level.
Yeah. Marc, I know you got to go. One last question or one last topic. What about like world economy, like with war in Ukraine, the energy disaster happening in Europe? Could it be the case that these centralized planners don't have the capacity to actually control the world? Or do you think that they will always find an opportunity?
They're going to find, here's the thing. They are openly talking about, they actually say, don't let a crisis go to waste. And I can't remember, that was Biden's administration official. The idea is, Vladimir Lenin, 1970s, Tsarist Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution, said the worse the better, worse is better. The more chaos and calamity you can instill, the more people are going to seek emergency government powers to save them. So if there was ever an opportunity to nationalize the energy industry, to nationalize food production, to nationalize transportation, this could be it. So it's going to go one of two ways. I think the opportunities are going to be fast and narrow. If we continue on this route, they're basically collapsing the current system as part of the plan, and they're going to rebuild it in their image, which is going to be a power flowing to a central authorities. So I can't really answer how that's going to go, but I will say it's part of their strategy. So the more they can collapse and the more chaos they cause, the more you're going to look at it. If we have a crisis with a virus, what does it lead to? Massive wealth transfers from poor middle class to wealthy, massive government control, more emergency powers. The perverse thing on food is they predicted for decades, climate's going to cause food shortages. Meanwhile, food production's off the charts, cereal, grains, wheat, you name the harvest. And not only that, NASA says rising CO2 is fertilizing the earth, crops, deserts are shrinking. So how are they going to get around this? Their policies now are intentionally creating food shortages. They're actually going after high yield agriculture and animal agriculture. They're going to create food shortages, which they'll then say, we told you so. We warned you climate would cause these food shortages. And then they're going to say, we need more, basically the same policies that caused the food shortage. This is how it works. And you're going to have idiots like Kevin McCarthy in the House or Mitch McConnell. And I think that this is probably an unfortunate situation. But that's it. They're not going to do anything about it. They're not screaming from the rooftop. So I would argue that we have to remake the Republican Party. Anyway, to answer your earlier question, as I'm thinking about it, if you're going to have an opposition party, they should actually be opposition, not just this pathetic thing that we have right now.
Yeah.
That's a tall order, almost impossible, because both parties basically are the same. I start out the book by talking about how Coke and Pepsi you think are competitors. If you look deep into their corporate and financial structure, they're basically owned by the same equity asset firms. They're actually not competitors. It's the same ownership group that owns both Coke and Pepsi, as an example. Same thing with political parties. That's my analogy.
Yeah. Well, so you're looking at a lot of dreadful things. How do you remain hopeful unless you're not?
Well, it's not that I'm not hopeful. We've faced many times dark days. If you go back, look at how Germany faced the Nazis. I mean, we had to go through hell. Look at how we fought World War II. Look at how we've come through this. But we just have to start recognizing stuff. And I'm telling people, go back to even 9/11. The 9/11 terrorist emergency led to the Patriot Act, which led to this surveillance state. As a Republican, everyone cheered it on, and no Republican would dare say anything bad. We got to get away from this partisanship, my team, their team. That's why I think my chapter about the progressives and the left wing joining with the conservatives and the libertarians is so important. We need a new alliance. And I'm not talking about the Forward Party of Andrew Yang, which is the same corporate financing as all the other ones in billionaire financing. Yeah. I'm talking about we need a new movement that's going to be freedom versus tyranny and just stop this. Essentially, it's corporate fascism and government. It's fascism, corporate government collusion. Biotech engineer Vivek Ramaswamy said it best. Ronald Reagan warned us the dangers of big government. We were on guard for the dangers of big government for decades, but we were guarding the castle from the front from big government. But then meanwhile, corporate collusion with government, fascism came in the back. And that's where we are today. And that's what we're seeing all over the place. And that's what's so scary, is that they can just switch stuff on and off at a moment's notice. And that's increased unbelievably in the last 2 years since the lockdowns.
Yeah. So, Marc Morano, your book, The Great Reset, is available wherever, or do you have a certain distributor that?
Well, it's available at the great Satan Amazon, which I've been railing on here. So it's kind of ironic. I'm trying to make money off of Amazon. I've actually been I've actually seen that a lot in the comments. What a phony I am that here I am railing about big tech, and I'm trying. Yeah. But if they're willing to sell, I want to keep Amazon selling books like this. It's amazing. They still sell climate denial books. They still sell, they're selling an Alex Jones book. So you want to support that as much as possible. But you can also go Barnes and Noble, I believe Walmart, I believe our store. If you go to Climate Depot, there's other ways to buy it. So, but Amazon is the simplest way. You can make Jeff Bezos richer and negate everything I just said here.
And besides the book, do you have other works that you do? Do you do speaking tours? Do you have like
yes, I'm on
some sort of institute that you're a part of?
Well, I'm part of a website called Climate Depot. It's part of a committee for Constructor Tomorrow. My Twitter handle is @Climate Depot. I just spoke to a doctors group in Las Vegas. I'm speaking next week in Santa Clara, California, and in Silicon Valley, Liberty Forum. I'm then speaking at the Eagle Forum 50th anniversary in St. Louis, and I'm going to North Carolina to speak. And then I'm going to, this is my favorite one, I'm going out to San Diego, California, and I think it's October 8th to speak with Scott Atlas and epidemiologists. It's going to be all on COVID lockdowns, and I'm speaking at that event. So I have a big book tour coming up here, and I just on Fox and Friends this morning trying to spread the message of California's energy insanity. So I did the speeches. I have the website, and I have two other books: Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate and Green Fraud. So
okay. So if people want to follow you specifically, your Twitter
ClimateDepot.com and Twitter @ClimateDepot is the best.
Excellent. Well, great work, great book. Thank you very much for filling my brain with fearful information.
Yeah, go gouge your eyes out and give up now. That's the message.
Never give up.
No, I'm kidding. All right. Thank you very much, Benjamin. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Marc.